So the decipherment of these ancient inscriptions, the art of epigraphy, became my second specialty. And it was through my fellow biologists at Harvard that Carter and I were introduced to each other's work. I learned that he had amassed a fine collection of American inscriptions in the hope that their eventual decipherment might explain or illuminate his own researches, and he, for his part, now found a man who claimed to recognize the languages on his tablets. We soon found that the emerging information is consistent with our other independent investigations, and so the seal was set on a collaboration that proved very, very rewarding. When word began to appear in linguistic and archaeological periodicals of this joint effort, other archaeologists and some linguists contacted us. A flow of information now began that soon swelled to proportions far beyond anything that either George Carter or I had dreamed of. The Epigraphic Society was established, and we began to publish our findings, as well as those of others, in a form readily available to other interested people, both professional and amateur. So began the busiest and most productive period of my life, an exciting journey through space and time, bringing new friendships in a score of countries. From the information that we gleaned from the first American tablets to be deciphered, we gained important hints as to where more inscriptions might be expected to be found. So I deserted my study table and the world of dictionaries for a while to spend a wonderful summer crisscrossing the hills and valleys of the New England countryside, rejoicing whenever a terrace or ridge top yielded yet another inscribed stone. My field companions and I became deeply aware of the presence all around us of traces of a vanished civilization that had once flourished here in America. Of these New England excursions, I was most often accompanied by John Williams, a young schoolteacher from Connecticut, who soon made himself expert in detecting the presence of inscribed rocks beneath the soil and later carried out many exploratory trips on his own. Between the two of us, we covered some 11,000 miles on the roads and hundreds of miles on foot, clambering up hillsides or more often pushing through the woodlands that once more occupy much of the back country of New England. We were often joined by my wife, Renee, who occasionally made discoveries of her own. Another frequent companion was Peter J. Garfall, joined later by Joseph D. Germano, who, whenever they would spare the time, would bring their cameras to record these finds. And when the suggestion was made at one stage in one of the newspapers that we might be forging the inscriptions, it became increasingly necessary to have cameras as well as witnesses on hand to record the thick coat of lichens covering these inscriptions before they were brushed clean for making a plaster cast. Other companions from time to time were our archaeologist friends and local residents who sometimes could lead us directly to a site known to them. Now, these were long days from dawn until near midnight, but we managed to bring back to Boston a very fine series of aluminum foil impressions from which casts could be prepared on days when the weather forbade this type of field work. The alphabets and languages that we found on American inscriptions are fully discussed later in this book. But the representative examples on pages 21 and 22 show how the American colonists or visitors wrote in the first millennium BC. So let's note the similarity to corresponding examples from Europe. Now, while John Williams and I roamed the New England outback country for Celtic inscriptions, another colleague was making notable finds in the Midwest and the Southwest. This was Gloria Farley, an intrepid explorer of the cliffs and caves that border the banks of the Arkansas and the Cimarron rivers and their tributaries. Armed with camera and snakebite anti-venom, rubber latex for making impressions, and a ladder, Gloria Farley systematically assembled a remarkable series of records of visits and settlements by European voyagers who had ascended the Mississippi River, and then turned west to follow the Arkansas River, eventually to reach the Cimarron River along the border between Oklahoma and Colorado. Her discoveries showed that some Celts had followed this southern route, and that Libyans and Punic-speaking Iberians and even one Basque king had ventured into the heartland of the continent centuries before Christ. Gloria Farley will be remembered for these fine contributions to our national archives. A bright example of grit and determination in the face of discouragement on the part of those who might have helped her. On account of the skepticism and even opposition to our work that we experienced at first from some of the professional archaeologists, nearly all of the inscriptions that we first examined were ones that we discovered ourselves. John Williams and Gloria Farley being the leading explorers. Later, when our work became better understood, we began to receive valuable help from museum curators and some universities or other institutions where mysterious inscribed stones or tablets had been deposited by finders long ago. We received no financial support from any scientific fund, but through the generosity and faith of Ruth K. Hanner, the Epigraphic Society has been able to establish its own modest fund, and this, supplemented by our family budgets, has financed our travel expenses and the cost of latex and other materials needed for making copies of inscriptions that we have found cut in the rock. Those who have participated in this exploration include Malcolm Pearson, a gifted photographer who has recorded inscriptions for many years and who originally led William Goodwin to the ruins at Mystery Hill. James Whittall, architect, archaeologist, a Harvard graduate, and authority on the megalithic structures of Portugal, Spain, and of New England. Robert Stone, the curator and present owner of the Mystery Hill site in New Hampshire, which he has protected and opened to the public, and who first demonstrated the existence of an ancient astronomical observatory among the ruins in an American setting. Elizabeth Sincirbo of Vermont, who perceived the antiquity of the supposed colonial root cellars and encouraged a young amateur astronomer, Byron Dix, to investigate what he later discovered to be calendar sites in that state. These, and others to be named in later pages, were the colleagues who now became our closest collaborators and who, like us, had to endure much opposition. But the work was its own reward, and all of us who took part in this research agree that we lived in exciting days, and we loved every minute of them. And yet these treasures are endangered. Christopher McIntosh, an English investigator, has given an account of the ever-increasing threat of destruction of ancient sites as a result of modern highway construction and like developments. He called his 1971 report The Race to Save Britain's Past. And it often seemed to us in Vermont that we, too, are racing against time, with the added threat of vandalism. And as the months went by, I perceived a change in the attitude of my field collaborators, who seemed to become imbued with a new zest, determined to save these relics, come what may. Well, boys and girls, that's Chapter 2 of America BC. It's the introduction to a wild new concept. That concept is that ancient explorers from the Middle East, the Far East, and Europe came to America by way of the Atlantic Ocean, sailed across the ocean, and had ports of call, colonies, and were digging tin, copper, and iron ore out of the Americas, loading it on ships and hauling it back to their home ports of call. Sounds preposterous that this was going on in the days of David and Solomon, the kings of Israel, of the ancient Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. But yes, boys and girls, it's true. There was an America BC. All right, America BC is written by Barry Fell. Barry Fell is a professor, he's dead now, at Harvard University. And as you see here, looking at the monuments, the America's oldest archives, is an 18-chapter presentation published back in 1989. It was first copyrighted in 1976, last published in 1989 by Barry Phil. You can probably get a copy at Barnes & Noble. It's pretty common today. I think the book is still in print. If you can't get it there, I'm sure that any used bookstore hooked up to the computer network can find a copy for you. It's fascinating reading. I picked up a copy because of a meeting that I had with one of his collaborators, a lady by the name of Gloria Farley. She died just recently. Now, both of these people have been doing this for 50 years. So go back 50 years and starting around 1955 or 60 or 65 or 70. These people were out in the fields. They were out in Arkansas looking at burial mounds. They were going up and down the Arkansas River looking at Hebrew and Irish Ogham writing and trying to decipher it, trying to figure out, well, where'd this come from? So they'd go to the Indian tribes and they'd say, well, now let's see, you Navajo Indians live here, or you Cherokee Indians lived here. Do you know anything about that? And the Indians would say, well, no, we didn't do that. That's not a part of our culture. But there it is. Well, if the Indians didn't put it there, then somebody else obviously did. As I began today's program, I said my wife showed me a pyramid. Now, I'm going to describe this for most of you people have probably never heard of these dirt mounds. They call them the mounds out in the Midwest. They're just mounds of dirt. You know, to most people, they're just mounds of dirt. Let me describe it. I was down in Mexico City, and I went out to the ancient pyramids. There's two of them out there. One's called the Pyramid of the Moon, and the other was called the Pyramid of the Sun. And I remember as a young man looking at that Pyramid of the Sun, I said, oh my God, these people here in Central America, when they built that pyramid, one of two things had to have occurred. Number one, the Egyptians came over here and saw that pyramid and went back and built some just like it. Or these Indians went over to Egypt and saw those pyramids and came back here and built one just like it. Or somebody has been to both places and brought the technology and the design and built it over here or over there. There had to have been contact between the Aztecs and the Incas and so on in order for there to be in this new world monuments built on the same architectural design or plan as those in the old world. Now, we don't say that the people of Egypt came from Mexico. We say that the people of Mexico somehow got there from Europe or the Middle East. And I don't know which is which, but I presume that the human race migrated out of the Middle East and migrated all over the world. And so, of course, the story that I was told when I went to school was that Christopher Columbus was the first man to sail from Europe to the New World. And when he got here, he found these people, which then devolved upon a conversation as to how these people got here. And so the logical conclusion was that since these people did not have an advanced merchant marine, that they weren't sailing around, they had canoes, but they didn't have ships that could cross the Atlantic, then they must have come from Asia. And when they saw these people, the Western Indians, and they saw that they had Mongol features, they said, they came from Asia. Therefore, they must have crossed the Bering Straits, which is only about 50 or 75 miles. They could make it across there in canoes because we know today that the Eskimos cross from Alaska to Siberia and from Siberia to Alaska. And then somebody came up with this ancient land bridge to fit in with the theory of evolution, and presto, we have the modality by which man got to the New World. That's what I was taught in school. That's what I learned. Now I sit down and I read this book by Barry Phil and I feel like a dunderhead, like a fool. These people that came over here and built those pyramids down there in Central America had to have gotten that idea from somewhere. Now what did they do? Go back across the land bridge for thousands of years and go down to Egypt and then come up across the land bridge? If that was the case, how come nobody ever wrote about it? How come we don't see that described by the Egyptians? Hey, we went up across the land bridge, went down to Central America or wherever they wanted to call it or whatever name they hung on it and built a pyramid. No, there's something more to the story. Something something is bigger and better than what we've been told in our public school system.